enormous concentration of power.
Democracy, poverty reduction, and cryptocurrency.
Are you sophisticated enough to invest in securities?
Bitcoin is actually a reversion to commodity money.
Decentralized social networking.
Welcome, everybody. I'm joined today by Dr. David Utzke. And if you read his LinkedIn profile, it says here, Dr. David Utzke, CFE, CFI, CCE, CBE, CBD, CEE, CSCD, and CDFE. It's quite a lot of titles. So I would love to get into it. I know him as a DeFi and tokenomics expert who has been working as well with the government to talk and has a lot of interesting perspectives that the regulators and people in charge of the public, looking after the public good may have about cryptocurrencies. So with that introduction, I'd love to ask you, David, to talk a little bit about yourself and how did you come to get so many titles? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, well, the titles come from just being a lifelong learner, which is what I encourage many of my grad students to do. I'm also an associate professor with the University of Advancing Technology, teaching distributed ledger technology, coding, architecture, and also smart contract and DApp development. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, I kind of cross over and bring some of my skills to the crime fighting arena in cyber crimes related to crypto assets and alternative payment systems. So I've actually been in this space either as a student, academic, and user for the last 30 years. So many people that think of this space as being relatively nascent is what you typically see many referring to it as. It's actually been in development since 1949 when Dr. Claude Shannon, who was also at MIT, started writing about and developed the concept of block ciphers back in a Bell Labs paper in 1949, coming out of World War II. So this technology is far from new. It's just new to many people, unfortunately.
Yeah, I love it because on this show, I bring people who have been in their space for decades, in their respective fields. And what I love to do is sort of try to bridge what they know with blockchain today. Difference with you is a lot of the blockchain stuff going on. Whereas, say, if I talk to Noam Chomsky or Thomas Greco, he's there. Thomas Greco, for example, is an 84-year-old community currency economist. So I bring up stuff that blockchain can do and the web can do, decentralized systems, and we discuss how his principles and his theories can apply to today's thing. But you're absolutely right. To me, cryptography, when people say crypto, it still means cryptography. It's short for, and I think that's true for most people in the space. Probably if you ask Nick Szabo, he'd probably say, yeah, that crypto means cryptography. But to so many people today, because they're coming from the consumer side, crypto means cryptocurrency. I want to get some crypto. So to them, they think that, and because cryptocurrency really took off with Bitcoin, but I kind of want to go further back, right? I sort of want to talk about what was your experience with the early eCash systems, and perhaps they were more centralized, but what was the dream back then? And also not just the eCash, but the complementary currencies that so many people put together. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that. And when was it? When did it happen?
Yeah. So if you look at digital currencies more broadly, and again, governments and NGOs trying to define this space have really done a disservice to it by confusing it. It's like, well, digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, virtual currencies, they're all the same thing. When in reality, they've existed as very different ecosystems for many years. Digital currencies has always been the overarching umbrella over virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies. Now they've been conflated and nobody understands the difference between them. So, I mean, if you were gaming back in the 70s or 80s, you were pretty much accustomed to using virtual currencies. And going back even further, before digital virtual currencies, you had physical virtual currencies that actually still exist in many community currencies, but many of them have started going digital as well. So if you are involved in, say, like Berkshire's or any one of thousands of communities that have local currencies as alternatives to the US dollar, you are dealing in a virtual currency. Virtual currencies are primarily defined around the fact that they have no code, centralized, and they have a synthetic economy that they operate in. And that isn't cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrencies are based in a cryptographic protocol, very secure messaging systems. Again, going back to Claude Shannon's work in secret messaging and developing a lot of the designs around circuitry that's still used in phone devices today. And so, I mean, you talk about being ahead of your time. Phone circuits now are still designed around what he created back in 1949, before there was ever a legitimate computer.
Oh yeah, I mean Claude, Shannon and Alan Turing and John von Neumann, all these guys were in the beginning the pioneers, and then later on you had Vint Cerf and you got the people building the internet stack. There was a race to build the sort of decentralized internet signaling, and then after that you had the web, about whom, interesting, Tim Berners-Lee and others. Vint Cerf said, "Oh, the internet was built by professionals and the web was built by amateurs." But the idea is that these applications that are built on top of the distributed internet are just becoming more and more sophisticated. So yeah, I mean, certainly we had cryptography, we had PGP for email, we were able to encrypt our emails. Phil Zimmerman created that. There was all these people in cryptography like Ron Rivest, the RSA protocol. And now with Nick Szabo, some people think he's Satoshi, or maybe he's contributed, but he certainly had the idea for smart contracts. Mm-hmm. And now, if we fast forward to today, we do have something new. We have smart contracts. To me, smart contracts are the biggest common denominator for what's interesting about the crypto space. And that is to say, everyone is executing the same piece of code, which is open source. And so you can, for the first time, be able to trust a program to do what it said it's going to do, as opposed to, say, being hosted in a shadowy data center somewhere. And so, yes, there are certain things. There's Intel has like these secure extensions, SGX, I think they're called, which you basically can sort of trust one company, Intel, to make sure that whatever's in that CPU is being executed, and you can, even though it's remote, you can sort of trust it. But with the blockchain as one of the many possible technologies that can replicate, implement a distributed system, the smart contract to me is the common denominator. With the smart contract, you have stable coins, virtual currencies, but you can also have things like exchanges like Uniswap. You can have, for example, DeFi of all kinds, like lending with Aave and others, over collateralization, DAI stable coins, and so on. A proliferation of new information, all based on the fact that you can write a program and go to sleep and know that that program will be running whether you're around or not. And I think that when we get into it, I think that is really the basis for all this new innovation, which I think didn't exist until, say, Ethereum came up.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, even to build off of your point around the decentralization around traditional finance, the added component is whether it be a smart contract, Ricardian contract, wormhole contract, whatever type of crypto contract that we're talking about, it's not a respecter of persons. It doesn't care what your gender is. It doesn't care what your skin color is. It will give you the same service as anybody else, which has been one of the biggest arguments around our traditional financial system, our governments, and everything else. And so why wouldn't people want to embrace that aspect in this day and age when you hear so much about just the opposite happening, right?
That's actually a very good point. The social impact of these technologies is what, our project at Intercoin constantly talks about. And social and socio-political implications. So like, it may be true that technologists were the only ones who knew about cryptography back then, yeah, but now it's become a multidisciplinary project. Often is the case, right? With computers, they were mostly for, let's say, nerds and geeks like myself. And then later, when Steve Jobs, let's say, invented the iPhone, then you can get calls, you can get notifications, you can browse the internet, and suddenly everyone is addicted to it despite themselves. So, even before that, already with Facebook and, graphical user interfaces, people started using it. My point is, as you draw in more and more people, you start to get more and more involved with socio-political effects and economic effects and others. So it becomes a multidisciplinary project, which is why we have to deal with regulators and all these things. So my question is, like, because it's become that way, and the smart contract is this technology that's available to everybody, what can we do with it? And one thing is that we can if we add additional assumptions, like one person has one account, it's a very hard assumption to enforce 100%. Of course, a person can have multiple phones, right? A person can have multiple identities that they carefully maintain. But if we're able to enforce that or ensure that 95% of the time, 99% of the time, can we then, as a society, start talking about voting, one person, one vote? Can we start talking about a universal basic income, which each person getting a same amount as any other person? Can we start creating these sort of more democratic systems where each person has just as much weight as any other person? And what can that lead to? So that's kind of my question. As I know it's a very open-ended question, but what do you see in that space?
Well, I would say that even the democratization of your data is so important in this area. So digital identity, where governments don't own your information. You own your own information and you share it with them to the extent that you want government services, that you want a universal income, if that's what you really want. I really think that that's where a big turning point comes, because right now, what you mentioned in terms of from a regulatory environment, more and more information is being required of keepers of big data. So whether it be banks, Amazon, Google, whatever the case might be, they have all this data collected on you. And now government through FinCEN and things like that are collecting your data. Who owns that data? Well, not you as the, as the person that owns that data. And kind of going back to your earlier point, why did this even become a project to begin with, to create privacy around digital transactions? I mean, if you go back to the 80s, when I started my undergrad education, studying financial economics and eventually going on to get my doctorate in that area, and then crypto economics at MIT, working in that area. So, you had David Chaum, who as a grad student at Berkeley in the 80s started writing about blind signatures, invisible payment systems, and why. Nobody asks the question why. And even if you talk about Professor Chaum, most people have no clue who he is. He introduced, I read another article today that says, oh, the first cryptocurrency introduced in 2009, when, the first cryptocurrency was actually introduced in 1990 after, Sir Timothy Berners-Lee introduced the World Wide Web back in 1989 as open sourced software, making it free to the public. And so that's what allowed the first cryptocurrency to actually be introduced, that David Chaum had basically developed. And the Bitcoin that you see on distributed ledger technology today is based in his work that he did in the 80s. And yet he was told by the government that you shouldn't talk about cryptography. Those are government secrets. And so...
Oh, that's right. Back then it was considered munitions, right? It was classified as munitions, and the export of very strong cryptography was prohibited for a while. And actually that Phil Zimmerman I mentioned with PGP, the way that he went around it is he published a book with all the source code of PGP, and that way he would export it under the First Amendment protections.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
And all of this led to the crypto wars of the 90s. So what we're experiencing right now with regulators heavily getting involved in, and by the way, the APA, which provides guidelines for journalists and media and things like that, came out back in 2017 and said you shouldn't call it crypto, back to your point, because it can be confused with the term cryptography when really they're talking about crypto assets or some type of cryptocurrency or something like that. And so even the APA is weighed in on, on the media side saying you shouldn't call it crypto, and yet they all do. Yeah, so you basically have nobody asking the question of why were we even introducing or looking at these types of things. And it really came out of the fact that attackers were stealing PII, personal identifiable information, from credit card transactions. So these retailers, whether you went in brick and mortar or you did it, through later on in the 90s through an internet connection, you had people stealing that information. They knew that identities were valuable, and so they could steal large volumes of them. And I call it the Walmart version of retail. It's all based on volume. So they typically get anywhere from nickel to a dime per identity. But when you steal 100,000 of them, that turns out to be a pretty good total. And you can even get up to a quarter for some identities, depending on how much PII is there. So, in a credit card transaction, they've got your name, your address. They're oftentimes even getting your credit card number. They're getting your social security number, which then leads to filing of a return that you didn't file. And for the rest of your life, you have problems with government regulators, whether it be the IRS in the United States or, the Revenue Service in Britain, or whatever the case might be. You usually end up with these ongoing problems. And the government wasn't doing anything to protect that identity. They weren't imposing regulations on retailers, merchants, or keepers of that information to ensure that it was properly being secured. And so it's like, this shouldn't have to be. So what do? We create a cryptocurrency that's providing privacy enhancements in the transaction, and only introducing those aspects of the transaction that need to be introduced. And most of it, you don't need identification for. A person wanting to buy a product and a business wanting to sell a product basically need to settle on a price and know that they're going to get paid in the case of the merchant, and that the consumer, obviously the concern is that they're going to get their product. And so you still have those ongoing concerns. Those really haven't changed, right? But in a cryptocurrency transaction, you had some assurance that the transaction that was being settled on was going to be the transaction that was going to be settled. And you weren't going to end up having a loss of your identity in the process. So this privacy enhancement came out of a necessity, because the government wasn't providing any protections around our identity. And I honestly can't say that it's gotten any better.
I think those are hugely important points. The technologists were the first to adopt Bitcoin and so on. But then shortly afterwards, it's the crowd that cares about self-sovereignty, and even in the United States without technology, there's like the sovereign citizen movement, the freedmen and land, there's the libertarians, for example, anarcho-capitalists and other types of anarchists. They've always said that, I don't need the government for this and I don't need the government for that. And often they actively resisted having the government manage the sort of things that, say, regular folks have come used to, hey, keep my money in the bank, have the FDIC insure my money. If something happens, I'm going to use my social security card. But like you said, a lot of these things, first of all, were mismanaged. I mean, hey, just the other day, you have private companies like Clubhouse, okay? You know, these companies, they take your address book, yeah, from your phone, and all of your, basically all of your friends and everybody that is in your address book, they go and they send to their servers, you know? Like we build apps, the groups app that we have, you know, you set up groups, you manage, you keep in touch with your social network. We don't send your address book to our servers, especially we don't store it unencrypted, right? And what they've done is everyone who's ever signed up to Clubhouse and their mother, but also all of their contacts, not just their mother, is actually now leaked. So it's one thing to leak all the phone numbers. I mean, that's just all the combinations of the 7 numbers and whatever. They have 3 billion numbers that are tied to names. And the names are as we put them in our address book, you know, with the nickname and everything. And who knows, maybe they took the notes too. My point is that trusting your data to third parties, whether they are states, whether they are privately owned companies, at the end of the day, you're first of all increasing the attack surface for society, because anyone getting that database, I mean, we have lists at Cubics, my first company, we have lists of like breaches, you know, in Brazil, doctors' records, medical records of everybody were leaked earlier this year. Last year in Israel, all Israeli adults, okay, and their personal details were leaked because of the Likud party's, I think it was their specific party's database, but could be whatever. It's not a specific group or a specific thing. In Iowa, there was the primaries here in the United States, and they had a while, you know, they had glitches because they were trying to use some third-party contractor. I do think that having a system that's reliable means having a system that's decentralized and that no one owns. And then the incentives are to design it for an adversarial environment where everyone's trying to get everybody else. And there are systems like this. There's the Made Safe project that started in 2006. There's essentially a lot of projects that encrypt data. Tor project, obviously. The difference is that Tor, there's one host somewhere, whereas let's say with Freenet or Made Safe, there are no hosts. It's just things are stored as they are needed. So, by the network. And the more they're requested, the more the network stores them. So the economics are very different. But the encryption, like you said, the privacy is important, because if we have third parties storing our information, we might want to encrypt it first before sending it to the third parties. I just want to mention, though, that none of this encryption stuff is applying to in the case of Bitcoin or Ethereum. Because in the case of Bitcoin or Ethereum, the encryption is not being used to, say, obfuscate the data so nobody can read the data, but really it's open to everybody. Everybody can see everything that has been done, and it's radically open and transparent. It's a different kind of approach altogether. The encryption is actually being used to do proof of work, and the encryption is being used to secure your private keys in your wallet with public key cryptography. But it's not being used to, say, encrypt a computer program or encrypt an order that I place into a marketplace so nobody knows what the order is. They have to know what the order is because all the machines running the Ethereum full nodes have to execute the code. And maybe in the future, we'll have homomorphic encryption and we won't know what we're actually computing. But today, we just have the same code running everywhere. That part is not encrypted. So I'm just saying that encryption for privacy is not the reason that people are using Ethereum, it seems to me. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would say, other than the criminal element, they bought into this concept that it was an anonymity protocol. And at the end of the day, the address that is created that you use to transact isn't anonymous. It belongs to me. A lot of people, and even my grad students, when we go through architecture and cryptography and hashing algorithms, they quickly learn that it's a privacy enhancement. It's not anonymity, because if it was anonymity, you'd see nothing there. But what you get is a string of alphanumeric characters that say, that's me. because all of that is associated with my public key, which came from my private key, which is stored in a computer file that's become known as a wallet. It doesn't store any crypto assets. What it stores is the key to the crypto assets that I hold or that represent my ownership on a distributed ledger. That private key is on my device. It doesn't tell you anything about my device. It doesn't tell you the MAC address. It doesn't give you the IP address or anything else. And yet it knows all of that information so that when I sign a transaction with my private key and my public key, my private key is saying, yes, this key belongs to this person, and the public key being used is associated with this person as well. So if that's the case, then it becomes a validated transaction. And so there's no anonymity here involved. Just because you don't know my name, well, if I do a drug deal with somebody, do I share my name, my address, and everything? That really is what becomes an anonymous transaction, because the government doesn't transact the serial numbers on the coins and notes that they produce. So in a private transaction that you and I might do, if we do it in private, it really becomes an anonymous transaction, because if you don't know who I am and I don't know who you are, how am I ever going to tell authorities, hey, I just did this drug deal with this guy. I used the drugs. I ended up in the hospital with an overdose because he gave me bad drugs. Well, what's his name? Well, I don't know. Well, where does he live? I don't know. But that's not the case in a cryptographically secured private transaction, say with Bitcoin, or as you pointed out, on the Ethereum platform using Ether. That address can be identified with an individual. It's fully transparent. There's an immutable ledger that provides all of the information of all of my transactions. The government doesn't get that with US dollars. So where's the anonymity and where's the privacy?
I think the technical term for some of this is a pseudonymity, being able to be somewhat pseudonymous, meaning if you are revealed.
And that's just another word that government and media created to say private.
Well, yeah, but I think
they don't want to admit that it's a private transaction. They'd rather, and they can't call it anonymous, because obviously in law enforcement, we're able to trace that transaction back to individuals.
Well, yeah,
and seize their funds and things like that. It's a term that they created, pseudo-anonymity, to basically avoid using the term, hey, it's a private transaction.
Well, look, I've had to deal with anonymity versus pseudonymity. Let me define it, because I think it is a technical term in many of the circles. I deal with the decentralized web, before I started Intercoin. So in 2011 or 2010, I started Cubics, my first company. And the idea of Cubics is to have self-sovereign social networks. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. Basically, you're having a social network you can run out of your house, something you can run off a phone. You can run it in the woods. You don't need the internet, okay? And the idea is you might want to actually connect people and do certain things, okay? And you don't need the permission of a Facebook or a Google Docs or whatever. You can run your own docs on your own computer. Okay, so we've built that, and I'll show you later, as I share my screen, I'll show you how it works. But the idea is, as you go from network to network, the question becomes, what is your identity? Okay, so you definitely have an ID within a network. You can have multiple IDs. If you're clever enough, you can sign up multiple times, and have multiple accounts. Some people do this on dating sites. There was an April Fool's joke by Google many years ago that, hey, you can create two wildly divergent accounts. One, you're a bad boy. One, you're a nice guy, very solid. And whichever profile attracts more, you're going to A/B test. Now, that was a joke, but people can definitely sign up multiple times. Yeah. So what is your identity? And, we met with Tim Berners-Lee's project in 2014. This was called the Solid at the time. Now they call it Inrupt. They got millions of dollars, and Tim left MIT to spearhead that project. But I spoke with some of the people at the W3C and people on that team who wound up they worked for Intercoin for very little time, and then they were pulled away to do the DID project. One of the people, the lead guy on the Solid project, his name was Dimitri. Forgot his last name at the moment. But he really wanted to see the standards bodies work together on this DID stuff. And, it really did. Some of the people later ran with DID, shout out to some guys at Microsoft who use DID now, the side tree protocol and these other things, put together, CSU Wildcat. Anyway, going back to what I'm trying to say is that pseudonymity is when you have anonymity up until the point where it's your name, your real world ID is connected, and it's shown that you controlled that private key, right? Like if Satoshi Nakamoto, if one guy shows up and signs a message with Satoshi's private key, then one of two things happen. Either Satoshi gave him that key or he is Satoshi Nakamoto, right? So at that point, you could argue that all of the previous activity by this person behind that key was really him, or that person knew him and gave him the key or something like that. So my point is, pseudonymity is that when you de-anonymize, that is, you link the activity of that public key to whatever, to this person, the presumption is that that person was behind all of that stuff. But until you do that, right, we don't know who's behind it. However, that's different than, so it's called unlinkability. You're able to link the activity to this person. Total unlinkability is to say that we don't know. These transactions happen in a mixer. We don't know if they're related at all. It might have been one person. It could have been multiple people. We don't know. So that's true anonymity. That's true unlinkability. But pseudonymity is when you have one public key. We don't know who it is, but once you do know who it is, the presumption is that person is the one that did all those transactions. That's what I'm basically, and that second thing is what Ethereum has. That second thing is what Bitcoin has, right?
Yeah, well, and one could say basically with my social security number, they don't know who I am, but they've got my number, but they can associate it if they can get the source, to the, the record keepers at SSA, Social Security Administration, then they can put a name, but just like, my Bitcoin address, for instance, is my ID. It may not be my, the name on my birth certificate, but is that who I am?
Well, there's one major difference between, sorry, I don't want to.
Let me just carry it over to one other point though. So basically that digital ID that you use in your crypto asset transactions is a moniker. And it's not unlike what happens in the realm of MMORPG. I use a moniker. And yet you see drug trafficking through these, you see money laundering through MMORPG, you see darknet activity, and somehow the government doesn't care about those, but and actually the whole virtual currency ecosystem is twice the size of the crypto asset ecosystem. And yet all the attention is being given to the cryptocurrency side and not the virtual currency side. And they defer it by calling it non-convertible. Well, what, again, the ignorance behind that is there were exchanges for virtual assets 10 years before there was a Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think we must get into convertibility of currencies to other currencies. I think that's extremely important, especially with Intercoin. We're trying to be convertible to every other currency eventually in the end. But I just want to quickly talk about the pseudonymity part, because I think, so take your example of having your social security number. How did you get that social security number? You came in and some third party gave it to you. You took your, you took your attestation. This is me, this is my, it could have been you, could have been someone else who came in, but whoever came in is now tied to that. And that fingerprint is stored, let's say, in some database. Now, the thing is, first of all, is that the third party gave it, and there's a web standard called verified claims, which is to say there's a certificate that, if they ever lose the certificate, anybody can claim anything as them. but let's say their organization holds the certificate and they sign that they gave you this social security number, and maybe some clinic signs that you came in and you took a test and you've been vaccinated, or you're free of this HIV or COVID or whatever on that day. So these are verified claims, and you can trade those claims. And over time, you need to be tested again and have a booster shot and vaccine or whatever. That's one. But here's my question. Imagine in your scenario, oh, by the way, the difference with public-private keys is that you can generate them yourself. You can generate them at home in your bedroom, and you didn't have to present anything. You could create as many as you want. And that's the difference between that and the government issued ID. But there's another thing that applies to both of them.
I know people that have multiple IDs with the government, and they're the same person. They did not create clones of themselves.
Oh, so that was, the government was messing up. Maybe they went to 2 different states and they registered as voters in 2 different states. I mean, that's illegal.
Or created synthetic identities or what have you.
So we have police and force in the real world to enforce these things. And like I said, one person, one account is a really important topic. Mm-hmm. And there's many ways to do it. But what I'm focused on is once you have that token, whether it's your social security number, which by the way is a terrible password, people use it as a password. It can't be used as a password. It can only be used as a
password.
Yeah, like, oh, you want to recover your account, give us your social security, your date of birth. It's like, dude, there's people on the dark web that have that combination, they can
as an ethical hacker, I mean, that's one of the first things that you try.
Exactly. So, okay. So my point though is that there's one difference that's major. Public-private keys, you don't have to fool the government. You don't have to put on a mask. You don't have to change your fingerprints. You literally simply generate millions of public-private keys in your own bedroom, just pressing a button, right? You can run a loop. So generating identities using public-private keys is fundamentally different than someone handing out social security cards, number one. But despite this difference, both of these are susceptible to the fact that if Satoshi Nakamoto's private key is leaked online and everyone has their private key, then we're all Satoshi Nakamoto, then we're all Guy Fawkes, we're all with the mask. At that point, we can never prove that Satoshi wrote using the public-private keys. If somebody leaks your social security number and it's on the dark web, you can always try to say to someone, hey, I didn't get this credit card. I didn't rack up these bills. Look, my social security is out. All my information's out. So once you give away your private key, once you give away, social security is crazy. It shouldn't be used as a private key or password, but give away your private key to everybody, you're anonymous. There's no way to conclusively prove at that point that this stuff that was signed.
You can't make attribution at that point.
Yeah, that's right. So you can achieve anonymity with public-private key cryptography by simply announcing your private key to everybody.
Sure, absolutely. And the same thing would be true of your other identities, because that's how an individual is able to assume your identity and take out mortgages, take out bank accounts, take out credit cards. They assume your identity, as in this scenario that you're playing out. If I give everybody my private key, they can all be me. Well, if someone gets a hold of my social security number and associated data, they can all assume my identity, file taxes in my name, and again, everything else that I've already mentioned. So I mean, that is again something that has been rehearsed over and over again, is not your keys, not your crypto, and so if you don't secure that, that's the same thing as not securing your social security number. You're going to lose an aspect of yourself that you can't get back.
Yeah, some people, I think, and again, I'm just speaking as a theoretical possibility. Whatever they do, I'm sure somebody did this in the United States. Rack up a lot of credit card bills and then get their information stolen on the dark web, and like, whoops, that wasn't me. It really was them, but they said, oh, I didn't buy all that stuff, because now people are opening accounts in their name. It's like, oh, yeah, if they're willing to deal with all that crap, they can probably get away with a few tens of thousands of dollars of purchases.
Well, and yeah, just talk to somebody that's been accidentally been put on or on purpose for something that they didn't do and put on a terrorist watch list and just try to get through an airport. It is very difficult to prove that you are who you say you are if called into question. I mean, how do I prove my identity? Well, I might be able to show some form of state identification or federal identification. But, at the end of the day, to get a passport, I send in some documents. To get a driver's license, I might have to go in, take a picture. And if I'm not really the person that I'm representing, but guess what? I've got their social security card, which doesn't have my picture on it or anything like that. And I go in and say, I am this person. Well, I can forge my state ID. And then, again, the whole anonymity thing versus privacy, kind of going full circle to protect your identity through privacy protocols shouldn't be a crime.
No, it shouldn't be a crime. I'm just talking about, so physically and what's feasible, right? I think the payment systems that we have today are missing a crucial element that at some point it's easy to add, but somehow they don't add it, which is to say, every time that I make a credit card purchase, it would be nice for it to show up, like my Apple cards, to show up and tell me, hey, this purchase was just made, and if I challenge that purchase within a certain amount of time, then a process gets started. And, there's tokens now that talk about how to arbitrate between the consumer and the vendor, because typically our fiat system has evolved to a point where you can have chargebacks with credit cards, for example, and they eat the cost. There's certain things in which we just say, look, there's a low level, but they go after the fraudsters. They try to mitigate the fraud using violence or using, saying the police are going to actually come after you, put you in jail if you keep doing this. And they do this also with counterfeiting money. Secret Service was originally created not to protect the president, that was later, but they were created to track down counterfeiters, which, by the way, we got to talk about the Liberty Dollar. We got to talk about some other things that I was curious how if the Secret Service got involved. But I just want to ask you or tell you, I think that the payment systems are lacking a crucial feedback loop, which is to say, if I have a phone, so just for the listeners, okay, it's usually in cryptography, there's three things that you want to produce: something like a password, something you have, like a phone device, and something that you are, maybe biometrics or something. So all these systems where I can walk out of a store in China and they can scan my eyes and I'll pay with it, right? I've just used my biometrics. And the problem with that is that they can just do a replay attack, meaning they can send those same biometrics or whatever's derived from those biometrics back to the network when I'm not there and pretend that I was there. If they do that, we're going to have to mitigate that with police and with, violence. But if they just added one extra thing, which is to say, hey, I need to actually use my biometrics on my own device, not on your, store, but on my own device, then in order to act as me, now you have to steal my device and you have to unlock it with my finger, right? So you have to basically kidnap me. And so then you have to maybe extract a password also from my head, add it, and so on. So there's more and more what are called factors, right? A second factor, a third factor, which is usually like second factor thing. And all I wanted to say is that in addition to this, whenever there is a purchase to be made, it would be nice if you had an opportunity to challenge that. You would know the purchase happened and it would challenge that. In that case, it would be harder to just give away your identity and say, well, my social security was stolen. So guess what? All these new credit cards that were opened last month, they weren't really me. They would say, okay, if it wasn't really you, who was approving all these transactions on your phone, which is in your hand right now, right? So you would have to literally divest yourself of a lot more than just your private keys. You would have to divest yourself of presumably your phone. I guess that's not a big deal either. But all I'm trying to say is I think it's important to have additional factors, not just have one factor to approve transactions.
Yeah, 2FA, two-factor authentication is limited. Case in point, I had an account with an online retailer, pretty large. Most people would know it if I said it, but I'm not going to. But basically, they'd lost control of, some of the accounts. Mine was one of them. And, along with that account information, of course, was my email address. And fortunately, I had backup alerts set on the credit card that I had associated with that account that quickly alerted me that there was some $2,000 worth of computer equipment that was purchased. And so what was interesting about all of that was after I thought I had the situation resolved, within a few hours, I realized that normally I'm getting pretty regular emails, either from students or peers or whatever the case might be. And my inbox just kind of dried up. And it's like, So I thought about it, and, I was going to call the provider. And I thought, oh, come on, wait a minute. I do this for a living. So I started digging into my email account, went through all the settings, everything seemed to be good. And I thought, you know what, let me just go into the advanced settings, take a look and poke around there a little bit. And what had actually been done by the individuals that got control of my information, my email address and everything else, they'd gotten into my email provider because they had enough information to basically authenticate that they were me, and then be able to begin setting up rules, advanced rules on what happened to any incoming email, because any incoming email would then alert me to what had happened, as well as any other types of accounts that I might have that they might be able to infiltrate and everything else. And so what it was doing was it had actually, they had programmed rules into my email, and it deleted all incoming emails except for certain ones that were then redirected to another email address that they had chosen. And so you have to be very, very careful, because these folks are smart. Cyber criminals are not dumb. Some of them are, but some are pretty smart.
Some are script kiddies, yeah, and some are.
Yeah, yeah, and so there's multiple ways to get into your account. So you can't just rely on email backup. Again, full circle to your point, you can't rely on two-factor authentication alone. You need to have backup systems, redundancies across all of your payment systems and your communication systems.
Yeah, I just want to, for the listeners also, I want to give a little bit of advice. So I was SIM swapped one time, and what happened was the individual called into AT&T and said, "Oh, this is me." Mm-hmm. They had all the information. That's one factor. Knowing something, one factor. And AT&T, based on that, they didn't text my phone, right, and say, "Hey, is this really you? Please enter these numbers," right? They didn't do any of that. Somehow this individual was able to convince AT&T to port the SIM, but they didn't stop there. They then, using that phone number, and I was driving home and I saw that my service was disconnected. Now, usually it's a bad thing to look at your phone while you're driving, but I have a bad habit. So, I was trying to call somebody and this happened. I was like, "But did we not pay the bill?" So luckily the attacker was not so fast. And so, I was going to fly out to Europe in a few hours. And all of a sudden I realized, no, it's not that we didn't pay our bill. It's that I was SIM swapped. So the problem was, then I started to look at all these other services. And of course I looked at my email. At first I thought, hey, I have Gmail, no problem. But the thing is, the Gmail was actually on my domain, meaning at Cubix.com, right? So what the attacker had done is, I started getting emails. They tipped it off. I would have found it anyway, but they started sending emails to my email saying test. I'm like, wait a second, why are they sending it to my email? So they're clearly trying to port my email. So what they had done is they got to GoDaddy and convinced them that now they have this information. And yeah, now they have my second factor, which is my phone number. So the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, has published a guidance a couple of years ago, now several years ago, saying do not use phone numbers as a second factor because they're susceptible to these sort of dumb organizational policies that anyone could call in to AT&T with one factor and not even use the second factor and port my SIM. Okay, so can't use those as, and if you have a lot of money, like Michael Turpin, one of our actually advisors at Cubics, he was SIM ported, SIM swapped, and he sued AT&T for $27 million. Meanwhile, his Bitcoin that was stolen probably is worth $500 million, but such is life, you know, $27 million. It looks like he won that settlement from AT&T. My point being that once they get your second factor, in this case, the phone number, then they can start porting your domain. And then once that's what started to happen is GoDaddy was like, oh, I guess we can port your domain. And then the MX records from the email start sending it to a completely different domain. So in this case, it's even harder. So basically what I had to do was put a second factor on GoDaddy. And a second factor is not your phone number, it's the authenticator apps. So like what I would say to anybody listening is, first of all, get a second factor app, Authy, Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, that's what they use. That's what they enforce now for all these exchanges and everything. And then the second thing I was going to say, and nobody seems to say this, but I did it, and I think most people should do it, is Google has these aliases for your email. So you could put like your username plus abc123 at, you know, gmail.com, and it works for any Gmail. So if you use these aliases, you can even set it so that each of your logins to Amazon, each of your logins to all these services cannot be guessed. So when the attacker calls Amazon or GoDaddy and says, yeah, it's me, and my login is your email, they're going to say, no, actually your login, we can't find you by that email. He says, what? No, that must be. And the reason is because you actually set up an email alias as your login. And so you have to know that specific alias for that specific service in order to impersonate you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, and you know, again, it goes back to the point of, you know, maintaining a low profile and protecting your identity, i.e. being private, is extremely important. And what you're describing in setting up aliases around your email, in essence, is what you're doing with cryptographic keys in terms of I'm privatizing my identity.
Exactly. But I do think that Ethereum and Bitcoin are not so much about privatizing your identity, so much as self-sovereignty, meaning I have my private keys. And with Bitcoiners and the maximalists, it's about no one can print more money underneath me. The amount of value I have today is the amount of value I'll have tomorrow. And even if Bitcoin never goes up in price, they feel like it won't go down in price either, because whatever the amount is, like, you know, but I think they're a little bit underestimating the speculative bubble that can form on top of the store of value.
Well, and that again is, you know, that aspect, Bitcoin was never designed as an alternative investment. It was designed as a payment rail. Ether was never designed as a payment system. Ether was designed as a currency for fueling smart contracts, which then led to dApps. We have totally adulterated the original intent behind these cryptocurrencies. DeFi is getting us back to a lot of that, as well as, hey, if you want an alternative investment, we can synthetically create that. I mean, we have whole exchanges in DeFi that have synthetically recreated the New York Stock Exchange, the S&P 500, the DAX, the Dow, you name it, Hang Seng. And so Wall Streeters came into this ecosystem early and started introducing themselves and interjecting themselves as third parties. You know, you already provided plenty of evidence why third parties, intermediaries, are bad. I don't even need to go into that. And distributed ledger technology, which is a completely separate technology from the cryptographic protocols that are used in cryptocurrencies. People still conflate these as being the same technology. In reality, they were introduced as two totally separate technologies for completely different use cases. And
by the way, just for the
we saw the Bitcoin aspect.
I just want to explain that part, and then please continue. Yeah, when you have keys to your car, they are not your car, right? So you store your keys in your wallet and you can copy the private key to another wallet. You're not actually moving your money. You're just copying the keys to your car. So it's like making a copy of your keys. And the car itself, the thing that you own, is on the blockchain. It's in cyberspace. It's replicated by multiple computers around the world. And so what you are actually storing and securing is just the keys to access and move and interact with the smart contracts or with your currency. But your currency isn't stored in your phone. So if you lose your phone, but you've backed up your keys with 12-word phrase, which I think is stupid. We got to move off of the mnemonic phrases. But whatever you backed up your thing with, you can reconstitute your key and get access to your currency again. Hopefully, nobody that has your phone will be able to unlock it. But if you are in a bar and you walk away to the bathroom and it's unlocked, then guess what? That's probably how your thing was stolen. It wasn't probably the maker of your wallet, although who knows? It was probably that you left it in a bar and you forgot to lock your phone. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mentioned early on that, the keys are this computer file we call a wallet. There are no crypto assets in there. All it does is it holds the key, like you say, to your car. I explain it to my grad students as, if I live in New York and I want to buy a property in California, well, I don't take the property from California and move it to New York. All I'm doing is changing the record of ownership in the state of California from the previous owner to my name as the new owner. And that's in essence what happens in a cryptographic transaction. So if I am what commonly ends up getting referred to as sending you Bitcoin, I'm not sending you anything. What I'm doing is, in a cryptographically secure transaction, allowing the ownership of that coin that's encoded into the Bitcoin network to be associated with a new address, i.e. your address, and it takes my address off of that coin. That coin doesn't move anywhere. And so even the verbiage that gets used by inexperienced people, or even people that, quote unquote, I've been in blockchain since 2012, I'm now an expert, the Bitcoin never got sent anywhere. The Bitcoin is the Bitcoin. It is on the distributed ledger. It didn't move anywhere. All I've done is associate it with a new ownership, giving it a new address that it's linked to. That address is cryptographically linked to the public key, which is also linked to the public key. And so this idea of sending something somewhere, nothing gets sent anywhere.
Well, yeah, there's basically your device that stores your private key and has an interface that's called a wallet, right? And you can interact with the network. And then there is the network. So the network is a third-party ledger. It basically says who has what balance. So that's how Ethereum works. Ethereum says this account has this much balance of this token and that much balance of that token, and then this account, and then you can execute transactions. With Bitcoin, it's something different. It's based on UTXOs, which is unspent transaction outputs. There's not really balances. But again, so there's essentially this idea that you have to have money that is divisible to the Satoshi, let's say, or it's really small pieces, so it always can be divided. But also it's fungible.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was also going to say it's fungible, so that essentially you can recombine it, and so it doesn't matter where you got it from. That's very hard to secure. I'm surprised they use blockchains for NFTs, because like blockchains are like basically NFTs as literally has one owner, and it's non-divisible. So like you don't even need a blockchain, because literally it's just like, well, let's put it this way. With fungible things, you need to make sure where did all these UTXOs come from. With Ethereum, you need to make sure that all this value locked in this smart contract is secured. But with the NFT, it's like, well, it's one thing. It's not divisible and it's not fungible. So like, why are they even putting all this machinery to secure it? There could be a lot simpler machinery to secure NFTs, because it goes from one person to one person. You could just store the history of it on the blockchain.
don't confuse tokens with coins. They're completely different. Coins are hard coded into a distributed ledger. Tokens are not. They can be moved around between different ledgers. And coins like tokens. They want to be tokens because tokens can do things that coins can't. And that's where the concept of wrapped coins came from. So you have wrapped BTC. Basically, you now have a BTC represented by a token that you can now transact BTC on the Ethereum platform. You can't take BTC and interact with a smart contract on the Ethereum platform. How do I do that? I wrap the Bitcoin first in a token wrapper, and there's over $1 billion worth of Bitcoin that are not in the Bitcoin network that are on the Ethereum network as wrapped BTC. And so, yeah, a lot of people get confused with the concept of, and again, I blame NGOs and governments for this because they say, well, token, coin, they're the same thing. And it's like if they really understood the technology, they would quickly figure out that they are not the same. They have two different functions, completely different coding. It just kind of blows people's minds when.
My co-founder Jason Page would love you. He was very. When we went to speak with the SEC in 2018, we drove down. I forgot my driver's license. Actually, I got in. They had to sign me, and we went down to the SEC building. We spoke with the I think it was a tax enforcement division or one of these financial. Anyways, we spoke with the people in charge there and enforcing the what they were going to do to the ICOs. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we spoke to them and we basically said, actually, we want to treat ITR, the investor token, as a security and so on. What can we do? And so on. I guess my point is he was insistent on in that meeting, he wanted them to know the difference between coins and tokens. I'm like, dude, this is not what the meeting is about. But he, but it went well. They had one comment about it and we moved on. But I was just telling him from my perspective, you're the only other person that I've met. It's really makes that distinction, but it's a very important distinction. Would it be fair to say that coins are like radios and other special purpose electronics, and tokens are like the iPhone or general purpose computers? And so they can emulate what coins do, but they're really capable of so much more because they're programmed to do what coins do, whereas the radio can only do what, in the 80s, that's all it did. And with the computer, it can play music, but also it can do a lot of other things. So tokens are basically coins that are implemented in a general purpose platform. Is that fair to say?
Well, again, yeah. I guess in a rudimentary way, it's not that you make a coin into a token. It's basically, with a token, it doesn't have to have a representative coin behind it. I can create a token. I can create it to be a relay token. I can create it to be a liquidity token. I can create it to represent an equity. I can create it to represent a currency, or I can code it to do any number or all of those things. I can't do that with a coin.
That's right. Bitcoin was designed, it was a first generation technology. It was designed to be a peer-to-peer cash system.
Yes.
And I remember what you were talking about. I remember I discovered Bitcoin back in 2011, I think, maybe earlier, but I have a Facebook post from 2011 asking the question. I like to write clever titles. I wrote, will Bitcoin do to the financial industry what Napster did to the music industry?
Right.
Back then, because of the whole Napster, I should have put and BitTorrent, because it was really BitTorrent. Yeah. But I'd watched the movie The Social Network, and that's when Napster brought down the music industry, but really it was BitTorrent. I shouldn't say brought down, because the music industry adapted, and Spotify and Napster and all of these Pandora radio stations, they had to adapt, just like any other industry. But my point is the governments always have to adapt to. No one is, we can print any seditious material we want in large quantities on my personal printer. We can have a Xerox copy or make copies. This was not the case 50 or 100 years ago. So the government knew exactly where the people were who were printing the material, and they could just exert pressure on those institutions and say, you can't copy this or you can't print that. Today, they've adapted. They kind of turn a blind eye. Oh, you've done this. So then after the fact, if it's child pornography, they will prosecute you. But if it's like they've expanded the scope of what's acceptable, and because they can't go after everybody,
I mean, yeah, but when you take a look at the massive fines, and I'm sure you saw the hearings with the Senate and the House this past week. The idea of attributing the increase in ransomware, for instance. I mean, there was geolocation around drug drops and money laundering and everything like that associated with ransomware long before there was a Bitcoin. And so when you take a look at what's happening in the traditional financial system, I mean, look at the fines against banks that have been handed out just in the last 2 years for money laundering, for executives allowing the money to be laundered through their systems or other individuals. I mean, the fines are massively greater than any ransomware or other nefarious activity associated with cryptocurrencies. And when you take a look at, just take a look at the US dollar. The US dollar makes up 60% of all fiat currencies in circulation. So you have about $11 trillion US dollars in circulation. OECD puts the estimate at between 3 to 5% of all global US dollar transactions are associated with some type of nefarious activity. Well, so that's 3 to 5% of $11 trillion. Right now, the cryptocurrency ecosystem setting at a little over $1 trillion. And what are the latest statistics on nefarious activity in that roughly $1 trillion ecosystem?
Well, let's talk about that. I actually want to share my screen and talk about that. But before we do that, I wanted to just really quickly go back to what you were saying about Bitcoin wasn't designed to be a store of value in the beginning. People kind of say it is now, but then again, Viagra wasn't designed to be an erectile aid to maintaining an erection. It was designed as a, I think, psychiatric drug. And then later,
super glue wasn't designed to put two pieces of physical objects together, on your broken RC car or anything else either. It was created for eye surgery. So, there's a lot.
Exactly.
We can go on and on with these examples.
No, exactly. But I just wanted to say, I remember here's my, bona fides is that if I go to show, here's in May 2011, I was talking about Bitcoin. And this is a question I posed to my friend Serge Bookman. Basically, I knew about Bitcoin 2011, and back then everybody was talking about it being a peer-to-peer cash system, right? So Bitcoin Talk, everybody in Bitcoin Talk, peer-to-peer cash system. And before that, Satoshi and his Usenet mailing list, talking about this. That was the title of his white paper, right? Mm-hmm. I would argue, and many maximalists would agree with me, that it failed at being a payment system, okay? Or, the word failed is incendiary, but I'm just gonna say that it found a new purpose, okay? Somewhere around 2013, I remember this happening. People stopped saying that it's a payment system and started talking about it's a store of value, Bitcoin store of value. I remember this time, 2017, years later, finally, VCs like Fred Wilson admitted, okay, this is what I did. Bitcoin is definitely, I hold it. It's a store of value, right? So literally the narrative changed. And then this guy who posted on, HODL, where does it come from? It's some guy in 2013 basically, wrote hold and he was drunk or something and he wrote it wrong. But I'm talking about Bitcoin in 2011, right? In 2011, the idea was this is going to be some sort of system that is a limited supply and pay each other, right? And people were telling Satoshi Nakamoto is like, well, how are you going to pay when so many people want to pay at once? It can't handle it, you know? And there's ideas about increasing the block size. And now there's ideas that Satoshi's vision originally was increasing the block size forever. And there's a coin by Craig Wright, who likes to be called Dr. Craig Wright. He claims he's Satoshi and all these things happening. And he's a foundation called Satoshi's Vision, or, you know, Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision. Anyway.
Don't even get me started on the whole, Craig Wright being.
Yeah, I don't even want to, but the point that I'm trying to make is that, and by the way, he could easily prove he's Satoshi by producing the private keys, which I think Satoshi never gave to anybody, and he can't do it. Or I haven't seen him do it. I don't know. Maybe he did do it. I don't think he did it. But anyways, my point is that Bitcoin wasn't designed for this, but Ethereum was designed to be powering all these tokens. But they always said that like our technology as proof of work is not scalable enough, and we're going to have to move to Ethereum 2.0. It's just that they spent years. It's been years, and they haven't been able. They painted themselves into a corner from day one. So it's hard to unpaint yourself once you're running on proof of work. You know what I mean? So
yeah, well, and again, I think it comes around to, you know, why do so many people get disappointed when things don't work out the way they wanted them to? It's because they had unrealistic expectations for the outcome of what they were, you know, trying to do. And people had the expectations for Bitcoin to become this replacement currency for fiat. It was never designed to do that. Again, it goes back to the original intent, even going back to the writings of David Chaum, that it was designed to create privacy in digital transactions, not to replace government fiat currencies and things of that nature. So, you know, anybody wanting it to become a global world currency, it's not designed for that purpose.
well, to be fair,
And
yeah, I just want
just, you know, one final note, when you take a look at just the whole store of value question, you know, that aspect of it is people get money and currency confused. Money is defined by economists. William S. Jevons is the first one to define money, and it was defined as a store of value, you know, a unit of exchange. There's actually 4 factors that he defined in terms of a monetary policy, but not every
medium of exchange,
currencies are defined.
unit of account. Yeah, that's
Currencies are defined, and unfortunately, this economist is plagiarized more than just about anybody I know, because governments use these terms: store of value, unit of account, you know, on and on and on, and never give credit to the, you know, who first defined it. I mean, he defined it in the 1800s.
well, yeah. I mean, look, Adam Smith is quote mined for his thing about the invisible hand. He only said invisible hand like twice, and one of them is a completely different sense in which he said it.
Well, and that's Adam Smith. I mean, you know, that goes to a completely different economist. But in terms of defining monetary policy,
Sure.
governments define currency. So what currency was, you know, in 1792, after Congress was created in 1789, their first thing was what currency is going to define the United States. And they came up with the US dollar. That's what they called it. And that's what we still call it today. So that defined a currency. It didn't define money. It just simply defined a currency. And if you look at the US dollar today as a store of value, if you've ever lived overseas on an economy where you have to spend the currency of the country that you live in, and I've had to do that, being in the military and things like that, the US dollar is not a stable store of value when you compare it to other currencies. because sometimes a dollar would be up and I could buy more of that foreign currency to be able to live on. And
Well,
hey,
that's markets.
you know,
I mean,
and vice versa. The same
sure.
happening. Basically, consider Bitcoin or many of the other currencies, not all crypto assets, but the cryptocurrencies within the crypto asset realm, because of the trading activity around them that's been introduced, you have a volatility that's now been built into it, and it acts more like a foreign currency because Bitcoin was actually created with the 21 million mint, with the idea of a 7 to 10 throughput, transactions per second, and all of these factors. It was really designed to be pretty close without pegging it to a US dollar, because
you're saying Bitcoin was designed to be close to the US dollar in terms of value or in terms of function? Or
in terms of function.
Because honestly,
all the protocols that are created into it mathematically, when you break them out, it was not designed to ever get to 60,000 or 1 million or whatever the hype is this week per coin. It was never designed to be that way, because it would destroy the functionality as a peer-to-peer payment system if you introduce this volatility into the system.
well, to be fair, I just want to say there's a possibility that Satoshi faked everybody out. If Satoshi is a group of people and not an individual, and that they faked everybody out by essentially saying it's an electronic peer-to-peer cash system, but they always knew that they were really building a commodity, a store of value that could not be inflated. And if that's the case, then they succeeded, because what's going on, at least for the moment, is that Bitcoin is adopted by so many people that it has effectively become like digital gold. Now, I'm not saying it's going to change the world's hunger issues or social impact issues or anything else, but it will be the commodity that is transportable, divisible, and essentially very securely stored in just your self-sovereign wallet. I think that's why it's so attractive to many people. I just think that all those properties were novel 10 years ago when Bitcoin was introduced, just like a VCR is novel when it comes out. But 10 years later, anyone can create an ERC20 token on Ethereum chain and have pretty much the same security. You could argue that it's Turing complete versus not, and therefore maybe there's less security.
But again, you're comparing apples to oranges again.
Yeah.
Tokens and coins are two totally different things. Tokens are created by a person. They're like, tokens are centralized. They're created and controlled by whoever created it. It is not a decentralized. So anybody that buys into the whole stable token mindset, the whole reason stable coins were called stable coins and continue, they continue to be called stable coins because that's just what everybody's gotten used to calling them. But stable coins are tokens. Someone created them, or an entity created them because they knew they were going to make money off of them. They control them. Look at the whole thing around Tether. They control USDT. And the whole fact of whether it's backed by, dollar for dollar or whatever you want to argue around that doesn't make any difference. The idea is it's centralized. The implication of when they started calling it a coin was to give the impression to people that it's on a decentralized distributed ledger like Bitcoin or Litecoin or Dogecoin, and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz.
Well, I want to get into the tokenomics next, and I want to talk about economics, but I just wanted to say from a technical point of view, and this is where I might disagree, I totally agree that stable coins are tokens on Ethereum or so on. They're obviously tokens, but I disagree on this. I don't think that all tokens are centralized. For example, if somebody just took ERC20, from Open Zeppelin, they just took the code and they created a ERC20 contract. I think that if that contract had specially called out certain addresses as being special, then yes, there would be special privileges. But if you just put an ERC20 contract with nothing, no special addresses for owning, minting, nothing. It would be decentralized, secure, and have pretty much this, all the properties of Bitcoin could be put into that very easily in a 20-line computer program, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you that if there are no fees being pulled out, going to some type or going to many smart contracts have. So they basically have the creator address as the address where fees for every transaction that goes through that smart contract, they're making money off of that. They have the ability, backdoors, things like that, to take advantage of what they've created. That's their baby. They created it. But if there is none of that, and no one has the ability to introduce or change any of that, then I would say that to the largest extent, it may not be decentralized or distributed, but it definitely has the component of being decentralized in the fact that nobody controls it. But now you have the introduction of smart contract code for self-destruct. So again, that kind of opens the doors for fraudsters too, because then they can rip off a bunch of people, self-destruct the contract, and you kind of lose all of the aspects of that. But
yeah, I want to get into the tokenomics.
Yeah, people don't dig into the smart contract to see if those addresses exist, to find out who's controlling it, or if there is control, or if there are profits being taken from the transaction.
Exactly. First of all, when you go to Etherscan, I think it's important. I think actually when you go on CoinGecko, you can go on Etherscan right here, Etherscan, and there's others like ETHplorer that I guess nobody seems to talk about. But on Etherscan, you can see on the contract, you could see the holders, you could see who has the most of it, and so on. And so you could say, okay, this one's got 2.5% or whatever. That's probably the origin address. I don't know. But so I want to talk about specific ones. And the reason I'm bringing up Hex is because actually, Linda, who introduced us, also made me look at Hex. And it's very interesting because, originally the guy that I spoke to, he was very critical of this project. And I came in thinking this is a scam, but ultimately, this is a very interesting case study because essentially it's mostly immutable. Most of the contract is immutable, and you're dealing with code that cannot be changed. But there are rules which funnel money to a certain address, right? For example, when people break their, so the way that it works is people lock up their currency. I think it's very important to understand the tokenomics of essentially what is a, I guess
you liquidity pools and things like that within yield farming and things like that. You do a lock. It's kind of a CD with a traditional bank. You lock up your money for 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the case might be. And then there's a penalty if you do an early withdrawal.
Exactly. So that penalty is essentially where the origin address gets, half the money goes to that origin address, I believe. So the question is, if it's immutable, or if the guy owning the origin address can log in and change the origin address to some other guy, let's say selling the whole project to that guy. The question is, how much is it really centrally controlled if that's the only thing they can do? There is someone benefiting off of it. But then again, Mark Zuckerberg owns a bunch of Facebook, and Jeff Bezos owns a bunch of Amazon. So and we don't necessarily distrust Amazon, the organization, because of that. So, if most of it is immutable, then what's, I guess enough. So my point is, enough people seem to trust this, that they lock up their money, right, in it, and it keeps being locked up and locked up. I don't necessarily like the whole idea of locking up money just because, you know what I mean? But the trust factors, first I want to talk about the trust factor, right? So these tokens are centrally controlled only in the sense that money goes to one party, disproportionately to everybody else. But other than that, if they're not centrally controlled in any other way, what would you say from a tokenomics perspective? Are these sound investments? Or are they a Ponzi scheme where essentially there's nothing but new people coming in to pay off the old people, essentially?
Yeah, so there's legitimate projects out there in the DeFi banking realm. lending and things like that. And so you kind of have to look at it in a little more of an aspect of the entire DeFi ecosystem. But with regards to even the smart contracts underlying them, you kind of have to argue, is the DeFi space truly decentralized? I mean, Uniswap has had to come out and say, well, we're not really truly decentralized.
Well, what do you mean by that? How do you, if you don't mind, I'm gonna keep challenging you to like define what you mean. So when you say,
so every time they find a flaw in the smart contract, what do?
well, that was a one-time thing, but yes, the recursion.
No. This has happened like in a half a dozen cases just in the last week with different platforms.
So I would say this, there are different platforms. Each one has a large network effect. And the more miners join the network, or the more people run the software, the harder it is to convince everybody to go to a new fork. Like Bitcoin had to fork multiple times, and some of the forks were silly, like Bitcoin Gold maybe.
Well, they didn't have to. They did because people wanted to go different directions. People are people. Everybody has unique needs. They want different, they have a different idea, different philosophy on
Sorry, what I meant by have to is that in order to change even the block size, the miners would not agree. So in order to do that, they had to
exactly. There again, there's the point of contention. And
right.
So you ended up with, roughly 105 hard forks, chain split hard forks, because I mean, a distributed ledger can have a hard fork without being a chain split. Monero hard forks all the time. Bitcoin Cash hard forks.
Oh yeah, you can't prevent a fork. I mean, people are free to do whatever they want,
right?
And
But
run any software they want. I guess
right.
What I'm trying to say is, once you have a large network effect, like there's no like, look, I think Ethereum has an actual use case. I think in the same way that people call Hex a Ponzi scheme, I would say call Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme. Like in other words, if there's nothing but the coin, right, for the value to come from, then all the money is coming from future investors realizing what the early investors realized, okay? So what is that? Either it's the store of value narrative of Bitcoin, right? A hodl, or it's the enforced hodl of the lockup periods in Hex. But my point is, like, there are projects.
Back up a little bit, because a lot of these DeFi systems rely heavily on stable tokens.
I'm not talking about those.
Public calls stable coins. And so in terms of the Ponzi scheme aspect, I don't, I'm not saying that there aren't those creators out there to create nothing but a Ponzi scheme. Bernie Madoff, created a Ponzi scheme. There's all kinds of Ponzi schemes out there in the traditional world. It's going to happen with technology as well. So you really can't necessarily prevent that.
Oh yeah, and I just want to be clear, by the way, to a certain extent, everything is a Ponzi scheme, which attracts more and more, concentric circles of early adopters and so on. The difference is whether there is solutions for actual like problems, right? Meaning, if you're selling Amazon and delivering like products, there's, they're serving the public. There are certain things. Now with these new projects, including Bitcoin, the narrative is that the product is storing your money. Like the product is a certificate of deposit. And I think that is a very interesting and contentious case because, to the credit of Richard Hart, he always stays away from saying that you're going to make money. You're only making money in this fictitious currency in the first place. So you don't know how much it's going to be. But, I guess my point is that there is no utility in Hex, at least not yet, or in Bitcoin. They could, but the more people adopt it, the more there could be utility. But right now, whereas, like, for example, Filecoin, Ethereum, right? They're used as gas, or they're used as rewards for storing files or for running computations. I think those are good for 5 years, for 10 years, and then faster, better things come out, and people can bridge the USDC stablecoin or whatever to that other, and they've done this. XDAI chain is, bridges the DAI stablecoin to XDAI and so on. So like it's faster, like it's more centralized for now. It's proof of stake. But if you build all these bridges, people are going to take the bridge off of Ethereum and onto these things, right? And the network effect is gone. You've built bridges to what was an island and now it's gone. But at least for that time that they were there, people paid gas because there's nothing better, nothing, that they had to run decentralized things, and they did. So the difference is that I think Ethereum from the beginning had utility, and I think Bitcoin and Hex and others, they offer you a way to lock up your currency, whether they say that you do it voluntarily or whether you enforce it on yourself, right? For rewards, carrots and sticks. But at the end of the day, that's all it is. That's all it is. It's a store of value. Is all it is, but it seems to have performed really well.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, just as the Ethereum platform has a use case, i.e., building dApps, which is what leads to Hex and all these other platforms. There are legitimate investment avenues of projects that are being funded through these DeFi liquidity pools. So I mean, to say that it's just money moving around. And you talk about Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg being stock owners in these companies, you have legitimate projects within these liquidity pools that are building platforms that actually have use case today. I mean, creating synthetic exchanges for building exchanges for synthetic derivatives and synthetic securities. You're creating something that didn't exist before. It's giving people globally the opportunity to increase their wealth using the traditional underlying market system for tokenizing those assets that only a few people have access to now. You and I can't walk onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and trade on our own behalf. Only the big money makers, the banks, the financial institutions, the brokerage houses of the world get to do that. I can now do it as a private individual.
That's exactly. Technology democratizes access. Remember, I spoke about printers, and you can print in your home and you can make copies in your home. I mean, the same is true of the web. The web enabled people to publish, all of these things called websites. Sorry, I think I was frozen for a second. The web has enabled people to, publish anything. So the New York Times and everybody has now to compete with the long tail of bloggers and so on. And, and traditional media has to compete with the Young Turks, and all of the spin-off derivatives that they have. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the Ben Shapiro show, not to leave out right-wing media. So my point is, it's true that democratized everything, and I think the same is coming to finance. But I do want to make a distinction. There are two major sectors of the economy. There's the zero-sum game, which is trading, right? In other words, for me to get B, I have to give up A, and for someone to get A, they have to give up B. And it depends which one becomes more valuable to the market later. There's one winner and one loser. So the way that the trading works and the exchanges work, right, is that essentially it's like a casino. People come in with money, let's call it stable coins or Ethereum that they bought somewhere, but they come into the whole system with
or US dollars.
And they basically then go ahead and make bets, and some of the bets pay off. But in order for you to leave with more money, necessarily someone else has to leave with less money. And the only reason it's not the case right now is because more money is coming into the system. And so essentially you can have constant appreciation. And you could say that about any industry. And I would admit that capital markets allocate capital to promising projects, right? But also I would say in capitalism, 95% of that activity is likely speculation. It's likely the hedge funds with their, algorithms and AI taking money from the retail guy who thought that it was going to go up, but they actually, hunted him and took his money.
But it's interesting that, in the traditional markets, they allow speculation with little oversight or regulation. They register to be able to offer the security, But I mean, even with some of the centralized cryptocurrency exchanges that did direct listings, data was showing that there was a flow of assets out of these exchanges in general, not just a specific one, but in general. They were moving out of centralized exchanges into the DeFi space. And so they were looking and trying to find new ways to raise revenue. And one of the ways that they were able to cash out was to begin doing these direct listings. And, again, you see the speculation in the traditional market, and people lose money, and it's like, oh, I guess you just didn't plan well, or you didn't look at the data. And yet in this space, they want to over-regulate it.
Well, you know what it is? It's like, hey, you lost to this grandmaster. I guess it's your fault, to get in the game. But people are encouraged to get in the game. And I guess they can give their money to a fund that will then employ, people to manage their wealth. All I'm trying, it's a free market.
Well, yeah. And one member of Congress during these hearings said it well. I think the traditional market has something, I was a securities analyst for 10 years, with a very large firm after I came out of the military. And at the end of the day, I think people are so overprotected that, one of the members of Congress finally just said, it's a buyer beware. You have your due diligence. You can't just walk into this blindly, throw some money at it, and FOMO, fear of missing out. All of a sudden, I'm just going to make money because that's what everybody else is doing, right? Well, oftentimes the media's partly responsible for that too, because they imply that everybody that's going into this is making money. And it's like, that truly is not the case. Going back to your point of, efficient markets being a zero-sum game from an economics perspective, that's not really true life. And,
I'm not talking about the efficient market.
But the idea of, doing your due diligence, and you can't continuously make money as a media leads you to believe, oh, everybody's making money in Bitcoin, get into Bitcoin. Blah, blah, blah. And then you get Elon Musk, and then you get, Jack Dorsey, and everybody starts talking about it, and the price goes up. Why is the price going up? Well, it's bound to what we call this supply-demand curve. What happens when the demand goes up and the supply is fixed?
Exactly. I think that's...
so it's an artificial inflation of the price.
Well, I don't know about artificial. It's designed to mimic gold and other scarce, non-renewable resources.
Yeah, but you don't see Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk going out and talking up gold and bumping up the price of it because something's going to happen to the supply. They're going to buy up a huge supply of the gold and lock it up, and this and that and the other thing.
Well, listen, there's a video of Jim Cramer.
When you put it in the corporate coffers, what are you doing? You're locking it up, right? So if I buy $1.5 billion of Bitcoin for the company as treasury holdings, I'm locking it up, and you've just taken it out of supply.
I want to play for you this video for 1 minute of Jim Cramer. This was back 20 years ago.
Back in the old days.
Admitting the kind of illegal activities, or we should say legal but unethical activities that hedge funds do, such as appearing and talking down a project or saying there's an imminent merger when there isn't, or whatever, and then just pushing the price around any way that they can. I just want to play 30 seconds of this. Are you still there, by the way? Sorry, I think I lost your camera. Okay.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, cool. Here, check this out.
Welcome to Wall Street. Short, meaning I needed it down. I would create a level of activity beforehand that could drive the futures. It doesn't take much money. Similarly, if I were long and I would want to make things a little bit rosy, I would go in and take a bunch of stocks and make sure that they're higher. And maybe commit $5 million in capital to do it, and I could affect it. What you're seeing now is it probably is bigger market now. Maybe you need 10 million in capital to knock the stuff down, but it's a fun game. and it's a lucrative game, and you can move it up and then fade it. That's often creates a very negative feel. So let's say you take a longer term view intraday, and you say, listen, I'm going to boost the futures, and then when the real sellers come in, real market comes in, they're going to knock it down. That's going to create a negative view. That's a strategy very worth doing when you're valued on a day-to-day basis. And
so basically he's talking about it as a game, like you would play chess or three-dimensional chess, right? But of course, now you've got computers and high-speed trading and everything like that, and AI and technical analysis. But when it becomes this game, right, and you're gambling with, let's say, food, like Goldman Sachs has, speculated on the price of food and drove it up for a while. Goldman Sachs food bubble, right? And lumber right now somehow was driven and so on. This has happened all the time. So, the point is that these banks are allowed to trade in all of these commodities. And so you're right, the zero-sum game, the losers are typically the retail people that need the food or need the lumber or need the thing, and they have to essentially buy futures contracts to hedge themselves.
That's where you get your puts and call options from.
That's right.
I grew up in agriculture, and one of the first things that you quickly learn about are puts and calls on, cattle, corn, wheat, hay, you name it.
That's the way it's got to be. 1 second. Did I lose you again? I'm sorry, my computer might be, but then basically he goes on to talk about how they manipulate the market by putting out FUD and really fake FUD. And somehow this is I hope it's illegal, but I don't know.
Well, and that's what I was, exactly what Jim Cramer was saying is exactly what I was trying to articulate with regards to market manipulation with, celebrity endorsements, things like that.
Oh yeah.
That's been allowed in this space, but if you were to do that in the traditional market space, guess what? So there's manipulation within this space by government. There's manipulation by people with money in this space, like the Elon Musks and the Jack Dorseys, and the list goes on and on.
So I want to now, I think this is a great segue to the main topic that I really wanted to get to, the meat and potatoes of this, and that's the tokenomics, okay? So there's a distinction between utility tokens on the one hand, utility meaning Filecoin, for example, you buy a bunch of Filecoin, so you want to store a bunch of data, and they're trying to decentralize Amazon Web Services. Or let's say you wanted to decentralize Netflix. So you would buy a bunch of Netflix type coin, movie coin, let's say, and then that would, finance, rescue, shows that were canceled, and the fan base would pay for the show to be reproduced, right, on this new network. So that is an example of a coin which you would gladly give up to consume, right? The people that would then, to consume movies, so the people who would then go ahead and purchase that coin. Let's actually, if you don't mind, just let me.
You're referring to a utility token still, right?
A utility token. That's right.
Yeah, which basically gives you access to a service.
Right, like Ethereum, you buy gas in order to get your computations to be run on so many machines.
Yeah, but Ethereum's not a token. It's a coin built into the Ethereum platform. It's different than.
It's a coin. It's a coin. So let's talk about what gives it value. The main thing that gives any currency value, in my opinion, the main thing that gives languages value or anything else is the network effect, right? We're speaking English. I'm speaking English because there's so many other people that it would be useful for. And that's why the schools taught me it, my parents taught me it. And so same thing with religions. There are some religions that are not followed very much, like Greek mythology about Zeus, right? There's maybe 50,000 people in the world maybe who sacrifice to Zeus or whatever. But most of those, ancient cults, the cult of Dionysus, have gone by the wayside. But there are cultures that are spanning the globe, right? And so it's advantageous to be part of that. It used to be that you needed to be christened with a name and baptized in order to get married in some cultures, so on. And it's the same with the Communist Party. You needed to be join the Communist Party and in order to be part of certain things that you couldn't be part of. So the in-group feeling. And so the network effect of something is what gives it value. Facebook was originally in Harvard. And when it was only 5 people that used Facebook, it was not very valuable. But when Facebook started to be used throughout Harvard, it became extremely valuable in Harvard. And that's an important point. The utility of something and the network effect of something does not have to be global. It does not have to span the whole world. Yeah. So I guess, so the first thing I want to say is that when you're building a network, your token could be usable in that network. It could be very valuable, but in 5-10 years, somebody could, if you don't have a critical mass, somebody could build a better network and just steal all of your utility. And then all of a sudden your token is not very useful because it's useful in your network, but there's this much larger, faster network that's better. And so that's how technology, that's how creative destruction works. But utility at its core is different than the zero-sum game that you see with these trading things, because people are willing to pay to get a good or service done, you know. So I think that's a huge difference between utilities on the one hand and trading on the other hand. What do you think about that, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a difference again. If you're making the assumption of an efficient market, i.e., everybody has the same information, then trading is a legitimate way of, you know, looking at an opportunity to increase wealth.
Okay, I agree. But if everybody if everybody was super clairvoyant and they knew the future and they knew that IBM stock would go down, who would buy it? I guess the people who would buy it? I guess everyone would sell it, right? I don't know. It's a weird thing.
Well,
Nobody.
I mean, that's when stocks turn into penny stocks. You know, so but here again, kind of going back to your clip from Jim Cramer, you have these issues of market manipulation, and sometimes the government lets it happen, even though they're there to regulate it and protect investors, and other times, you know, they're all over it, and so it creates an inconsistency around the assurance of how efficient are the markets really, how well is the information disseminated by companies who are supposed to be sharing information with investors to make that determination of, is it going down, is it going up? I mean, there's been a case of that just in the last week.
Yeah, I mean,
a big one.
Tell us, what is the case? I don't know this when we're recording this. What is what was it?
Well, I'm gonna have to. We're pretty much at our 2 hours, so I've got another meeting I've got to jump to.
Oh, we got to jump. Okay.
Well, but yeah, I mean, I can articulate that later. But
we have another 2 minutes. I just wanted to wrap it up, and maybe we could do one more. Oh, sorry, I cut out for a second. I just want to. Do you have 2 minutes? I just want to wrap it up real quick, and then we can.
I'll give you 2 more minutes.
I'd love to bring you on just to finish this, because I want to talk about the actual tokenomics. You know, if it's okay.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, we ran out of time, but I definitely wanted to talk about the regulations and the FinCEN guidance from 2019 and 2013. Which, anyway, here's what I'm going to say. I think that the Ethereum blockchain is transparent. It's super transparent. If anybody would do futures on it and derivative contracts, everything would be in the open. And it would be a very interesting game when everyone knows what everyone else is doing. I'd love to see what happens there. It might be a more transparent market because everything's on chain. I don't know if the government should love that transparency. At least
one would think.
Was that?
What one would think.
One would think. I mean, the government doesn't love transparency for itself, but it certainly loves transparency in the markets, right? It loves transparency in what people are.
Again, one would think.
Yes. So I do, however, think that it wants to go that way. I've spoken to some people at the SEC. They want disclosure. And so I'm just going to sort of ask you 2 quick questions, and then we can pick it up another time. Intercoin, for example, when we went to raise money, we made a private placement memorandum. I know it's called private placement, but we publicly posted it, and you know everything about it, the time frames, the bonus structures, the everything, all the risks are disclosed. And so we treat this as you would sell a security. We paid lawyers a lot of money to build this. But when it comes to building a utility token, something that will be consumed, the SEC has come out with guidance, and they've said certain things are not securities, which we'll talk about another time. I personally believe that the reason so many large projects failed, like Telegram, Kick Messenger almost failed. Here's Pavel Durov, the director of Telegram, saying it himself. It was banned in the US because, in my opinion, I do this analysis, is because they use the same token to raise the money in the first place. And then they turn around and try to turn it into a currency that's used in their platform. And with Intercoin, what we tried to do is separate those two things, because that's one of the big things we do at Intercoin is separate the separate things, right? We have communities and we have individuals. We have tokens that we use to raise money from investors, and we have currencies. So in other words, and I think we have to have another call because this is like a huge topic, but I just want to say that I think there are certain ways to be responsible in this space. And when you're raising money, you treat it as a security. And I think that the SEC would like to see this level of disclosure from, at least this level of disclosure, probably audits and other things for, Reg A plus and all this stuff. But at least for Reg D, they'd love to see disclosures of risks. And I think that is what a lot of the crypto projects are missing. We don't know who the devs are. We don't know if they dox themselves. We don't know anything, if these influencers have been paid. We don't know anything. And I think that's why the SEC has been so sort of interested to get these projects to have disclosure. Everybody knows there's risks, but what do you think? Like, do you think they'll be satisfied with projects treating, filing Reg Form D and all this stuff,
Here's the reason that you don't know who Satoshi is, and this is the same reason that a lot of the developers don't want to include themselves in disclosures like that. Came out of the crypto wars of the 90s. The government ferociously attacked them, threatened them, spent tons of money in lawsuits protecting and defending themselves. That is, Elizabeth Warren made the comment, these shadowy developers, these bad people, why would you want to put your name on that?
Well, we're not shadowy, for example, but yes.
But what happens if somebody misuses a platform and you become the shadowy developer? You see what I mean? Anything can happen. You do not know what's going to happen in the future. Satoshi knew that. The team lived through the crypto wars of the 90s.
Can you explain what the crypto wars? Who were the players? Because most people don't know that there were currencies in the 90s, digital currencies in the 90s.
I've talked about them, and people that live through them have talked about them. I mentioned it at the top. You look at David Chaum, he was even approached by the government. You don't talk about cryptocurrencies. You don't talk about alternative currencies. You had influencers back then too. You had Whoopi Goldberg, who was promoting Flooz at the time.
Flooz? Is that Flooz or something?
Yeah, Flooz.
Flooz.
Beans was another one, but then you had gold, eGold, and DigiCash, and there were hundreds of centralized cryptocurrencies back in the day, and that's what made them vulnerable, was the fact that they were centralized cryptocurrencies,
like Napster. Yeah,
which is why developers went to work in 2000 at the end of that decade of crypto wars to find a way to decentralize it. And Doctors Haber and Stornetta had come up with this build out of a blockchain from this concept of block ciphers, and boom, lo and behold, cryptocurrency technology meets distributed ledger technology, and we had Bitcoin.
Last thing I want to ask you real quick, because I met Scott Stornetta back in the Government Blockchain Association. We helped to build their apps and for their events. And so can you tell me, what is your perspective? Did he invent blockchain, or did he, how much would you say was his contribution to the space?
Well, I wasn't involved in their work. I read their white paper, in 92. after they introduced it in 91. And so, a lot of the concepts that came out of it are not exactly the same blockchain that was introduced in 2009 with Bitcoin. And literally, when people talk about blockchain is not a thing. Blockchain is a category of things. I mean, there's over 850 variations of blockchain. And even then within distributed, I still hear people refer to, distributed ledger technology, another name for it is blockchain. Well, actually, blockchain is one type of distributed ledger technology because we now have blockless distributed ledgers
Exactly.
since 2016. And so even those aren't, that new, that people shouldn't realize that, right? But they don't. They just call everything blockchain, not realizing what it is that they're dealing with.
Oh, there's so many distributed systems like BitTorrent, and I met Bram as well. Basically, a lot of these currencies, a lot of these networks are actually, they don't have a bottleneck like a miner and a blockchain. They don't have a block. And these guys, like I just wanted to say, started in 2006, before Satoshi, before everything. And they now have a GitHub made safe. Again, I'm not affiliated with that project. I'm in awe of what they've done. So there are many projects like this that have stuck it out and created, non-blockchain based, let's say, networks. And I believe that's the future. I really do believe that blockchains are not great for currencies. And at Intercoin, we had to struggle to fit currencies into the model. And we wound up basically having two levels of blockchain. One blockchain is for the central currency, the Intercoin, and the other is for each community and so on, like layer 2.
Yeah.
And that's
and that would be a great topic to talk about. Is government the place? F.A. Hayek, another economist, has argued you can't have a truly capitalistic environment if government is going to control the currency. And so, again, it goes back to governments manipulate the markets. They allow things to happen that shouldn't happen in certain cases and vice versa. But I am going to have to jump to this.
Yep. Let's do this some other time. Thank you very much for coming on, David Utzke.
No, I always love the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks, Greg. Take care.
If you want to see more videos like this, click subscribe and then remember to click the little bell icon so you get notifications. To Intercoin, making crypto mainstream.